For a strange stretch of older company history, the evening gown match occupied a very specific place in World Wrestling Entertainment's presentation. It was not built to showcase athletic competition in the traditional sense. It was built around humiliation, spectacle, and the deliberate use of embarrassment as entertainment. The objective was simple: strip your opponent out of her evening gown. That alone tells you almost everything about the era that produced it. This was a period when the company often treated certain women's gimmick matches less as contests of skill and more as vehicles for shock value, novelty, and visual spectacle. That is what makes the evening gown match worth talking about now. It was never meant to feel like a serious sporting contest. It was designed to be easy to understand, easy to market, and instantly provocative. A formal gown in a wrestling ring already created a sense of absurdity, and the stipulation turned that absurdity into the whole point. In the short term, that gave the match a certain kind of appeal. It was visually memorable, immediately clear, and perfectly suited to a time when the company leaned heavily on spectacle in its women's presentation. For a while, that fit into a broader company philosophy. During the Divas era, World Wrestling Entertainment frequently framed many women's segments through glamour, sex appeal, and novelty. The terminology of the era reflected that mindset, and years later, even performers who lived through it acknowledged the baggage that came with the Diva label. By WrestleMania 32, the company formally announced that female performers would no longer be referred to as divas, but as superstars, and introduced a new women's championship in place of the Divas Championship. That change matters because it helps explain why gimmicks like the evening gown match now feel so tied to a version of the company that no longer exists. And that is really the forgotten era of the evening gown match. It was an era in which a stipulation like this could exist not as an outrageous exception, but as a recognizable part of the company's television language. The match surfaced in different forms and variations, sometimes directly, sometimes in closely related gimmicks. The company's own archive still reflects that world clearly. Cyber Sunday 2004 offered fans a choice that included an evening gown match, and the company later highlighted the notorious hardcore evening gown match between Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe from King of the Ring 2000 as one of its most bizarre matches ever. Those examples say a great deal. This was not one isolated oddity. It was part of a larger entertainment style that the company was openly comfortable presenting at the time. But that same quality is also why the concept faded. An evening gown match could create a memorable image, but it was difficult to build meaningful stakes around it. A cage match can end a feud. A ladder match can headline a major rivalry. An evening gown match, by contrast, was almost always built around embarrassment first and competition second. That made it useful as a novelty, but limited as a lasting attraction. It could get attention, but it could not easily become important. Over time, the company moved away from that style of presentation. The shift was not just about one stipulation disappearing. It was about a broader change in how women were framed on company programming. Once World Wrestling Entertainment began moving away from the Divas era identity and toward presenting women as full competitive equals within the roster, gimmicks built mainly on humiliation became harder to justify. The company did not need to formally ban the evening gown match for it to vanish. It simply stopped fitting the direction the product was taking. And that is why the evening gown match now feels less like a lost classic and more like a relic. It belongs to a period when the company was willing to make almost any visual gimmick into a match if it promised enough shock or curiosity. It lingered because it was simple and eye-catching. It disappeared because the company outgrew the kind of presentation that had made it possible in the first place. In the end, that is the real story of the forgotten era of evening gown matches. They were never meant to be timeless. They were products of a specific company mindset, a specific television style, and a specific way of presenting women that eventually gave way to something very different. That is why they are remembered now with a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and discomfort. They were not just unusual matches. They were signs of an era that World Wrestling Entertainment ultimately left behind.